Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to view Quick Change from 1990. Come to find out, I believe this story was also to be adapted to be some other film, but it kind of just went nowhere. But I was to be really interested by the beginning of this film because we have Bill Murray in a clown costume and he's robbing a bank. I was like, okay, what is this movie about? Easily. And from that simple idea. So, come to find out, uh, a little behind the scenes about this movie also. So, we of course have Bill Murray playing a character called Grim, and we had Gina Davis who's playing a character named Phyllis. Come to find out, the first working day that Bill Murray had with Gina Davis, Bill Murray had gotten upset with Gina and yelled at her first day in. Because not only was Bill starring in this movie, but he was also directing or co-directing in this film also. So come to find out, Gina was to go on and be very uncomfortable by Bill Murray during certain interviews of this film, or just there was a lot of times where she was just I didn't like working with him. Come to find out, those kind of stories happen quite often more recently. We have Seth Green, who talks about him going on Saturday Night Live on Good Mythical Morning, stating that he was dropped into a dumpster by somebody who'd also be known to get into fights with people on Saturday Night Live also. So, anyways, interesting. We have Groundhog's Day co-stars that were to have Bill just kind of star them out, really just stating that Bill was to feel like he was to be a bigger star than them, and so leaving that co-star just okay, I'm just gonna I'm gonna be here and I'm gonna work and I'm just gonna cash my check and see you later. So yeah, what an experience. But when really looking at it, that could have just been a bad movie. That could have just been maybe an actor during that time period. But these stories start stacking up, and I know there's a lot of people that are also to be Bill Murray fans, whatever anyone is to say. It's well, I want to hear Bill's side of it, because Bill can do no wrong. So is what it is. So with that said, let's go on and talk about this movie. So, like I said, Bill is to be a clown in the beginning of this movie, and so he goes in to rob this bank. Come to find out, Bill, who is Grim, is not robbing this bank alone. There are two other people with him that are in disguise in this bank. And so, come to find out, Grim is going to need these two other people to then help them sneak out this money so they can make the perfect getaway. And so the biggest problem isn't even the fact that they're going to sneak away from this bank. The real biggest problem is the simple fact of these characters need to go on and get out of the city, get out of the state, get out of the country. And so, with these characters desperately trying to get a car, desperately trying to get a cab, needing to go on and get to the airport, that is the biggest problem of this film. And so, with that said, that could be very simple for a lot of people, and I can understand that. But there's also some kind of funny, like, one-liners in this movie, also. So I like that about this movie. And so, I think a lot of people would probably want to compare this to, like, Joker or the movie Falling Down with Michael Douglas. Like, to me, like, I don't know if I quite go on and I see those, but, like, the easiest comparisons would probably have to be those kinds of movies, or maybe even like The Dark Knight, like the beginning of it, where it's like a bunch of clowns all robbing a bank. Kind of seems similar. So we have me just kind of want to go on now and just get into spoilers, because really there's not much else to say about this film. Again, this movie is very simple, but I liked it. So the grading of this movie to me is, like, I want to say that it's an okay. It's an okay. It's probably too simple for a lot of people, and that'll be probably the biggest complaint. And I can completely understand that it's a very simplistic film. I think a lot of people might just be surprised more about like stars that kind of have like small roles compared to everything else. But so, with that said, where can you go on and see this movie? Currently, it is to be available on a number of certain apps that have this $2.99 rental. I'm going to go on and tell you you can go through a number of apps to see this movie for absolutely free. And so here are those. If you are to go on and have a Google Play Store app, you can there in fact be able to watch Quick Change for absolutely free by finding an app called Doxy, Doxcy. You could also go on into the Google Play Store and find an app called Play, UHD. And then, surefire enough, you should be able to watch Quick Change as well as probably a number of other movies for absolutely free. The next ones that I would ask for anybody to go on and find, they are kind of difficult. I will admit that. You got to find the perfect one, and so on and so forth. So the next one would be 123 Movies. You got to find the perfect app for this one, because 123 Movies tends to have apps that either the server doesn't work or you can't access the content, and so you gotta find the right perfect 123 Movies. I think the one app that I downloaded has the word like hub on it, so that might help people. You can also go on to find an app called Yes Movies, and if Yes Movies probably doesn't work on a Google Play Store, you could probably go on and find a format equivalent of it, or you could probably just go through a Google search for Yes Movies and maybe find a better version. I'm not quite sure. So, with that said, now that I've gone on and stated all of that, I think it's about that time to just double five this bad boy up, because it's about that time yet again to, of course, just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. I apologize to anybody who are like die-hard Bill Murray fans, and I am to go on and to have told stories about some unsavory moments, and probably a lot of people be like, I don't care, like, I just like the guy's body of work, and I'd be like, me too. I could care less about what kind of goes on behind the scenes, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen either. So, with that said, going into the beginning of this, we start out with Grim, who's played by Bill Murray. And so Grim is made his way to the subway dressed as a clown. And so Grim is walking through these streets trying to get to this bank. And so we have this guard who is closing the door on Grim, and Grim is like, "Oh, no, 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 like, I just want to go on and just do one thing." And the security guard is like, "Well, I'm sorry, but we're closing." And so Grim is to whip out this gun and be like, "Well, how about you go on and change that?" And then the security guard is like, "Okay, like, hey man, like, I get it. Uh, like, just please don't hurt me. Like, I don't get paid enough for this." Like, Grim is like, "Seriously?" And the security guard's like, "Yeah." So Grim, the security guard, just go in there. And the funny thing about this is we have the security guard that afterwards is to go on and make up all this story and all this crap about he was to go on and try to save people, but then all of a sudden, like, the security guard was taken like off guard by this clown, and so like he was really trying to save the day and believe the crap that he was selling. But anyway, so we go on to have Grim that makes his way into this bank. And so Grim immediately tells everybody, "Hey guys, I'm robbing this bank." No one cares. Everybody just keeps continuing, waiting in line. Everybody's like, like, as if they didn't pay attention to him, as if they didn't listen to him. So Grim is just like, "Okay, all right," like, nobody cares. Pow! Shoots the gun in the air, and then everybody's like, "Oh my god!" So immediately we have Randy Quaid's character, who is Loomis, who is immediately to be the very overly scared person in the bank, who's like, "We're gonna die, we're all gonna die." And so as everybody is just being shoved into this vault, and we start to hear the police that are surrounding this bank, we have Grim that goes on to have the store manager make his way to call the police and state, like, "Okay, uh like, this guy has explosives all over his chest. We can obviously state that." When Grim is to kind of lift up uh and see, like, he is like neck to waist uh like full of these pieces of dynamite. So the store manager is telling these people, it's like, "Well, hey, like, don't try to get in here, like, this guy is rigged to explode." So come to find out, we have the chief here, the chief, who of course is Chief Rotzinger. And come to find out, this is the most cliche-ish of cliche-ish cop stories for this man, because this chief seems to be on his last, like, story here, his last mission, his last job, which is to be this bank robbery. And so when the chief is to go on to kind of go to this bank robbery, and the chief is asking everybody, it's like, "Well, hey, what are you doing?" And they're like, "Well, we're waiting for the hostage negotiator to come here." And the chief is like, "Oh, no, you're not. Like, I'm gonna be dealing with this case, and, like, not this hostage negotiator." So I'm like, okay, this chief is being very stern. He's kind of like wanting this to be his last case. So the chief goes on to call in into Grim, and so the chief, of course, wants Grimm's demands. So Grimm ends up asking for a helicopter, he ends up asking for a bus, and he ends up asking for a motorcycle and a monster truck. And so the chief is just like, okay, like, but hey, if I'm going to deliver these things, you're going to give me a hostage. And Grimm is like, sure, that's perfectly fine. So we go on to have the bus and the bike arrive, and so the chief calls Grimm. It's like, okay, like the bus and the bike are here, like, where's my hostage? So we have Grimm that has gone on and told these hostages that if anybody is to go on and be a troublemaker, they will be dealt with, and there might be some casualties along with that. So come to find out, Grimm is now going to the vault. It's like, okay, like these guys want this hostage, and we immediately have a guy who's to be called the Yuppie Hostage, who seems to be a very rich man, is going on and telling Grimm that they had all chosen him to get out of here. And so Grimm is like, well, like, who died and made you king? like I haven't decided that I'm going to have you leave here. So the Yuppie Hostage also tries to buy off Grimm by giving him this watch as an incentive for Grimm letting him go. And so Grimm is like, oh no, like, you can't just give me some gift. Like, I can't let you just give me this watch. Like, how about I buy it from you? Like, how about, like, I give you, like, 3 bills? And the guy's like, $300? And Grimm is like, yeah, like, $300. And so the guy is like, well, like, if that's all you got, then okay then. So the hostage gives Grimm his watch, and so Grimm is like, well, like, here's my watch. It's like a cheap Timex or something. And so Grimm is still not going to let that hostage go. Instead, we see that Grimm is looking at this one hostage who ends up being Randy Quaid's character, who's going on and complaining that everyone is all going to die. And so Grimm is now looking at Loomis and it's just like, man, like, it seems like he's being a troublemaker. It's like, hey, guys, like, how about we go on and, because he's being a nuisance to all of you, how about we just get rid of that guy? And everybody's in a clear consensus of like, heck yeah, like, get rid of that guy because he's going to kill us all off. So Grimm takes Loomis and is to kind of toss him out. And so Loomis is to state that Grimm like wants to be a man and that he's gonna take everybody with him and so on and so forth. So we have Grimm who's kind of watching this on the TV and it's like, wow, like, kind of overstated, right? We also had Grimm here who was shooting out all of the bank cameras for, of course, good reason. So we had a moment where the chief was to try to get some SWAT team to try to get into the bank, and what Grimm goes on to tell the chief when he has this conversation with him is, it's like, well, hey, like, maybe I have all the ventilation shafts, maybe they're all rigged to blow, like, how do you know? And so the chief is like, oh my god, like, this guy's really thought all this through. So the chief calls off the SWAT team, who is now trying to rope their way up this building. And then once they hear, it's like, oh my god, this guy has explosive rigs to blow. Like, they decide to like kind of fall back. So we go on to then have Loomis get his chopper and everything that he is to ask for besides the monster truck. And so the chief is calling Grim again and be like, okay, like, where is my hostage? So Grim then goes back into the back. And so Grim has handed this woman like $1 million of money. And, or like, Grim is getting this bag from this woman who has $1 million from the bank. And so Grim ends up kind of dumping all of this money out on this table, and he's been taping it. So when Grim goes back there again, he then is to go on and see this woman back there. And this woman, of course, is Phyllis. And she, of course, is going on and telling everybody, it's like, well, how can you let this man just kind of like do this? Like, how can you just kind of have him take control of the situation, yada yada yada? Because I guess Phyllis is to like think that like, well, hey, like, we have the numbers, we can kind of take this guy out. But so we immediately have Grim that is to see Phyllis and is like, well, hey guys, like this girl, like she's becoming a problem, and so like, should I get rid of her too? And everybody's in clear consensus of like, yeah. So now come to find out, we have Grim that grabs Phyllis, and so come to find out what happens is that there are two hostages that end up getting released. And the chief goes on to talk to those two hostages, and it ends up being Phyllis, and it ends up being another hostage that seems to be a red-headed man. So the chief is going on to talk to this red-headed man, and so this red-headed man is complaining about how maybe this redheaded man should go back into this bank to deal with this murderer, and instead of coming out here for how he's being treated. And come to find out, that redheaded man is none other than Grim himself, who is disguised as another person. So Grim, Phyllis, and Loomis reunite to get into this car and drive away to get to this phone booth. So Grim is to have this phone booth where he is making calls into the bank phone to talk to the chief without them realizing it. So finally the chief is to deliver the monster truck to Grim, and so Grim ends up making the excuse that the monster truck isn't the right monster truck because there is obviously certain hydraulics, or there's certain things about it that like doesn't quite fit the bill. And we have the chief who's just like, what does it matter? What does it matter? So the chief is like, okay, I'll go on and I'll get you the right monster truck. Because Grim is just stalling for time at this point. But also, while Grim and the chief are having this conversation, they end up hearing this car horn accidentally go off by Loomis, and the chief is to probably realize, like, well, wait a minute, maybe, like, this person isn't to be where we think he is. because of that sound. So, come to find out, Loomis and both Phyllis are talking in the car, and Loomis is getting concerned that Phyllis, or or Loomis is getting concerned that Grimm is not going to go on, and possibly have them get out of here. That maybe there's going to be a problem that arrives. Maybe Grimm is to like the thrill of the kill, so to speak, or the thrill of the crime, the adrenaline rush of it, and maybe they're not going to get out of here as easily as they think. So, Phyllis is to go on and talk to Grimm, and so Phyllis is to go on and talk to Grimm about the time that they worked together at some point, and Grimm is like, yeah, I remember that story, and he starts to go on and talk about the whole night, and so that was the night that both Grimm and Phyllis decided to go and rob a bank together. And so Phyllis is like, well, yeah, Grimm, about that night. And so Grimm is like, oh. So, but then they shift it to just kind of talk about Loomis. And so Grimm goes back into the car and is talking to Loomis. And so they're trying to get back on track here. And so we go on and we have our characters who are driving to realize that there is some construction work going on with the sign of a place that they are not familiar with. So all of a sudden we have Grimm that has asked these construction workers, is like, well, hey, like, were you the guys who took off that sign? And like, where is the new sign? And they're like, well, like, no, we just needed to take this sign down. And so they're like, well, wait a minute, like, we need to go to that area, that direction. Like, could you tell us like where it is to get there? Because you're locals, right? And they're just like, yeah, like, we don't know. So we have Grimm, we have Loomis, we have Phyllis who are just like, well, like, maybe we'll just continue to drive this one direction, and like, maybe we'll be fine. Maybe we'll figure something out. So come to find out, that does not end up being the case, as every time Grimm or Lewis is trying to get directions from somebody, it's from someone who does not speak English. So we even have a point where two people are doing this unusual, like, God, what is it called? Like, jousting thing with these wooden sticks and these bikes. And I thought that was interesting. So we have our characters desperately going on to need directions from anybody, and they have no clue. So we finally go on to have a car that is parked on the side of the road, and Grimm is like, okay, like, I'm gonna go on and I'm gonna ask this guy. And both like Phyllis and Lewis are like, well, do you sure we can like trust this guy? And Grimm is like, well, yeah, because this guy is out of state. And like, I think also that this guy like might have something like shady about him also, and he might be criminal, might not, but like, maybe we can trust him more than we can anybody else. So Grimm goes on to meet with and talk with this guy, as he immediately states, hey, yeah, like, I have this this map, and like, we can kind of figure out together if you want to just kind of come over here, and like, we'll figure out where you need to go. And so Grimm goes over, and so what happens is that this guy goes on to try and carjack them. He pulls a gun on them and is to try to empty their pockets of all their money. And come to find out, it's like nobody has any money out of the three of them, because of course they don't, because all of their money is like tied or taped underneath their clothing. So it's like the perfect disguise. So the carjacker takes off with Grim, Phyllis, and Loomis's car. And so now we just have these three characters that are just desperate to, like, hey man, hopefully we can just go on and find a taxi somewhere. We can find a cab. So they continue to walk on, and luckily, as Loomis is to pray to God or whoever, that they are to find themselves a taxi, and they do find one, who of course is to be driven by Tony Shalhoub, who a lot of people know from Monk, or just a number of other things. So, we also had a scene where Grim was to tell both Loomis and Phyllis that they should go back to Phyllis's place, so that way they can go on to get an exchange of clothes. And what happens when they go back to Phyllis's place is, come to find out, someone else also lives there. And that ends up being Hal Edison. And Hal is to immediately think that these people are like squatting or trying to rob him. And so Hal whips out this gun, and come to find out, Grim comes up with a strategy to have Hal get distracted. So Grim ends up asking Hal, it's like, well, hey, how much did you pay for this place? Like, how much did you, how much did your rent cost? And Hal ends up saying his figures, and then Grim is like, well, that's strange, because Phyllis was to be charged way less. So maybe you should go on and you should speak to the landlord, and you should get a better deal. And Hal's like, yeah, you're right. So after Hal was to go on and find out about that, like, Grim and Loomis and Phyllis were like, let's get the heck out of here. So so the three of these characters go on to be desperately hoping for a cab to drive by, and then so Tony Shalhoub ends up arriving here and is to drive them to a location that they don't even know if they're really going to. Because come to find out, Tony Shalhoub is a cab driver that doesn't speak any English. So we come to find out, when these guys are trying to talk to Tony, they're hoping that they're going in the right direction. And so come to find out, what ends up happening is Loomis starts to get crazy, because Loomis is to not know if they're going in the right direction. They're desperately just trying to get to this airport, and Loomis at this point is to see another cab close by, and so Loomis just jumps out of the car, because he's like, oh my god, I'm just gonna go on and get to this other cab. Maybe that cab speaks English. So Loomis jumps out of the car, ends up making a pretty good impact and hurting himself. So he has this big gash in his forehead, and it seems like he might have a concussion, or he might have some injury of sort. So Graham and Phyllis take care of this cab driver, or take care of Loomis, And so the cab driver is going on like, hey, what are you guys doing? So on and so forth. So this all leads to have these three characters that are like, hey man, we should get the heck out of here. We have this store owner who is calling for the cops to look after Loomis, and like, we don't want the cops. So come to find out, these three characters run off onto this bus, and the bus needs exact change for cab or for fare. And so we have Grim, who's like, well, like, there seems to be a store over there. Maybe I can ask them for change. And the bus driver is telling him, it's like, well, hey, man, you have like 2 minutes. So Grim runs off to go to this store. And that, of course, is to have this woman who has all of this crap, all of this product that she is buying from the store, and she's taking her sweet time asking for like decaf coffee and all of these things. Like, here's the one story that I have that maybe I've stated this somewhere. So I went to this Walgreens at one point, and you not, uh this woman, of course, uh didn't have a lot of items, but the things that she did ring up, she was paying it with pennies. And so she was like counting them all out individually. And I'm like, oh my God, seriously? And so, like, this like 5 minute thing took like 20 minutes because this woman had all these pennies and she was counting them out individually. And then she's like, oh yeah, well, I need this too. And here's another roll of pennies. I'm like, oh my God. And I was like, man, I know I would go on and I would have these like stack of pennies also, but like they would be in these kind of like these cylinder like things that obviously would be like, they would equal to $1. So it'd just be like, hey, like, here are these big fat rolls of $1. Like, hey, you guys can count it if you like. So, but I would make it very like efficient to where this woman is like taking every individual penny out, like 1 penny, 2 penny, 3. I'm like, oh, miserable. And I think the thing that I was buying was to be this thing where I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna give up. Like, it was just some like simple toy that was like $7 or something. I was like, no, like, and I was a kid, so that's why I had this thing. So, anyways, and then come to find out, when I went in that store, like the following day or whatever, the same thing that I was gonna go and buy, gone. Of course it was, because that's always what happens. So, but going on, so we have Grim that goes on to have the one woman leave, and so now Grim is just desperately buying this item so that way he can kind of make for change. And so, come to find out, the cash register, the guy behind the counter, ends up having to break these roll of quarters, or these kind of roll of things. And so what ends up happening is this guy, of course, breaks the thing to where all of the change just comes flying out. And so Grim is grabbing every piece of it. And so we, of course, have Grim who's like, okay, like, here's your change back. So Grim is just desperately like, can we get this over with? So Grim gets the right change back. And so Grim goes on to get on this bus. And so we're also to deal with another part of this story. So Grim, Loomis, and Phyllis are to just go into this place that the door was unlocked, so that way they can hide out in this location. And come to find out, when they do that, they turn around and find that there is the mob here, and they're asking Grimm, it's like, well, hey, are you gonna be the guy who is collecting this money? And Grimm is like, well, yeah, of course I am. Like, and so like, well, who are you? Because I've never seen your face before. And so uh, Grimm states, is like, well, yeah, I'm Chip, or I'm Skip. And so we end up having uh, these guys. We have Johnny, who goes on to talk to Skeleton, and Johnny is basically just repeating everything the other guy is stating. And so they're talking to one another, and so by the end of this, like, it all works out. Johnny ends up giving Grimm and these guys this money, thinking that this is the guy that they should be giving the money to, because wants or Grimm wants this money. And so the mafia guys are like, well, hey, let's look into this. Let's make a phone call. And Grimm is like, well, hey, if you're going to go on and you're going to call this guy, like, you're going to waste that guy's time. So, like, and he's going to get ticked at me because, like, so they end up, because, like, Grimm just kind of gets into their heads, they just give them this money. So now, by the time that Grimm gets back to this bus, we all of a sudden have Mario that is to be the real guy who should have gotten this money. And so Grimm is running into the bus to have this bus door close, and Mario is to be, like, grabbed by these policemen. And so come to find out, because Johnny is to kind of point it out that it's like, well, hey, that's the guy. So the police end up getting involved, arresting Mario, and Grimm ends up getting the right fare. They end up driving off. So Phyllis is taking care of Loomis and babying him, metaphorically speaking, and Phyllis is kind of rubbing on Loomis's head, just kind of, and Loomis is like, yeah, like my mom used to do this. So come to find out, Phyllis ends up letting it slip that she is going to be a mother, and Loomis is asking, like, Phyllis is like, well, does Grimm know this? And so come to find out, when Phyllis and Grimm get alone while Loomis is sleeping, we have Grimm, who is, like, asking, like, Phyllis is like, well, hey, how is Loomis? And Phyllis is like, well, yeah, he's fine. And Grimm is like, should we get him some formula? Because that, of course, is the baby joke. So come to find out, this movie is actually right before they filmed Ghostbusters 2. So it's kind of funny. We go on and we have Bill Murray, who is to be doing a movie where, like, he's talking with a woman who is who's going to have a baby, and then he goes on to do Ghostbusters 2, where Sigourney Weaver is to have a child, and Bill Murray's character Peter Venkman is now dealing with that in the sequel film. So we go on to have Phyllis, like, talking to Grimm, and we again have this moment where possibly Grim is asking Phyllis about like, well, like how do you feel about babies? Like, and Phyllis is like, well, why bring that up at a time like this? And Grim is like, I don't know. I'm just asking you this question. So Phyllis is to really just be tempted to not tell Grim that she's having a child because she's very unsure about who Grim will be for her. And so Grim is to find out that this bus is going to stop just short of the airport. And so Grim ends up asking this bus driver, it's like, well, hey, then, like, how long of a walk will it be once we get out of this last route? And the bus driver says, like, well, it's about a 20-minute walk. So Grim is like, well, okay, all right, I'll tell my other people that. So Grim tells them that, and it's like, well, yeah, like for Loomis, like he's technically injured, but we're gonna have him go on and try to walk here. So come to find out, we have this bus that kind of wraps up on his last route. And so we have the chief that goes on and is to talk with both Mario and both Tony Shalhoub's character, who is the cab driver, and they're trying to figure out where Grim and his people are because they figured it out that they were to have escaped from this bank heist, and they then realize that these people are on the move and they're just kind of really ahead of them. So we have this chief that is going on and asking the only two people who were to have seen Grim and his people. And so Mario goes on and on about this bus, and Tony Shalhoub is to kind of mime this bus thing. And so it's like, oh, like he must be on a bus. So they go on and they track down what bus that these people are on. And so by the time that these guys all get out and start walking, the police are a little bit too late. And so we have the chief that all of a sudden has Mario kind of pull him aside and is telling him a bit of information about the airport. So Grim, Phyllis, and Loomis are to try to get their tickets for this airport. So Grim goes on to try and cut ahead of everyone. And that, of course, leads us to have Russ Kane, who is upset that this guy is obviously cutting. It's like, well, hey, man, like, we were waiting here, like, you're cutting in line, obviously. And Grim is just like, oh, no, I just have a simple question. And so all of a sudden we have Russ Kane, who is complaining to this glorified stewardess and whatever, this guy, because he couldn't do a real man's job. So Russ goes on and then is to be complaining about this guy, and so Grim just starts asking this guy's question, and so Grim is looking at the other guy, is like, ha ha ha, like, I'm gonna get on this plane before you will. So Grim goes and gets the tickets, and then we have our characters getting on this flight. So we now have the chief who is like, oh my god, like, we know that they're going to the airplane. We're going to figure out and stop this plane before it takes off. So come to find out, by the time Loomis, Grim, and Phyllis are trying to get onto this plane, we desperately have Loomis who's like, hey man, like, I can't take having this money like strapped to my body anymore. Like, we gotta just take it off. So Grimm goes on and is in the bathroom, and he is ripping this stuff off of Loomis's body. And we have a guy in the bathroom who's like kind of cleaning his hands, who's like, yeah, like, you guys go on and own this town. Like, assuming that these guys are just kind of going at it, and that like Grimm is like forcing this guy to like please him and whatever. So like the sounds and whatever that these guys are making. So so they make it onto the plane. We now have Loomis's money that is now to of course be in this thing of luggage. So they then go on to have both Grimm and Loomis like maybe having a problem, thinking that Phyllis is not going to be on the plane, and that maybe Loomis had kind of given Grimm the idea of maybe Phyllis is going to bail on Grimm, and Grimm is like, no, like, I need to go on, and like, I need to be with Phyllis and have this baby, because while Grimm, Loomis, and Phyllis were to find this JFK kind of cart that was dragging along all these things, Phyllis, Grimm, and Loomis finally had the conversation, because Loomis is kind of very out of it, and he divulges that Phyllis is pregnant, and then Grimm is like, wait a minute, like, since when? And so Phyllis talks to Grimm about this, and he's like, okay, all right, like, I accept that, like, we're gonna have a baby together. So Grimm and Loomis are thinking that Phyllis is not going to be on the plane, but then all of a sudden, we then have the chief that comes onto the plane, and he is trying to get after Grimm, Loomis, and Phyllis. So all of a sudden, we find out instead that Russ Crane is on the plane also, and it seems that Russ Crane is a much bigger fish than Grimm, Loomis, and Phyllis are. So we have the chief who is making Russ a top priority, and in all the commotion, we have, of course, the chief that arrests Russ and ends up going on to have Grimm like caught in the middle of all this. And so what ends up happening is Grimm is to now tell like Phyllis, who kind of comes out of this bathroom. Grimm is like, oh my god, like, hey, like this chief just arrested this guy and I helped. So we have the chief that is talking to Grimm after he arrests this guy, and the chief is asking Grimm, it's like, well, hey, I should give you accommodation. Like, I should go out of my way to give you one. And so we have the chief that is now asking Grimm, it's like, well, hey, what's your address so I can give you this accommodation? And Grimm just kind of is like, okay, I'm going to tell you, like, what my address is. And so Grimm gives this guy this address, this phony address. And so he's like, okay, all right. So he walks off. And so we come to find out have Russ, whose wife had gone on to have an affair with some other guy, and come to find out that was Mario, the guy that squealed on Russ, hence why Mario wanted to get Russ and have him be arrested because he was having an affair with his wife, anyways. So by the end of this movie, uh, we have Russ who ends up getting arrested, and so the chief is just like, yeah, like we got our man. And then, but all of a sudden, the chief then realizes he's like, wait a minute, like that guy that I talked to, he sounded so familiar. And then he's like, oh crap. So come to find out, the chief was to realize that Grim was the guy that he was looking for, but he had gotten Russ instead. So he's like, well, like, F it, like this is as good as I'm gonna get here. So come to find out, the chief's partner was to call on all of this press to show what a good deed the chief had done, and his partner had told him that. It's like, oh, well, good for you that you did that for me. So we end up having the chief just kind of laughing it off that he made this mistake and got this kind of bigger fish to fry anyways. So we have Grim, Loomis, and Phyllis, who are all now in uh, their seats on their plane. We have Loomis who's kind of laying on top of both Phyllis and Grim, and like he has a pillow over his head, and like that's, we kind of just see these characters just make their way off to Fiji, I guess, and so that ends up just kind of ending this film. And so with that said, I think I'm just going to try to get out of here because I know that this movie was only an hour and 20 minutes. I'm almost been talking for an hour. So let me get out of here. Let me know in the comments below if there's any big things that I've forgotten about, because I'm sure that there probably is. Let me know how you felt about Quick Change. If you liked this movie, if you hated it, if you thought that it was stupid, it was too simple, because I know that that can be the biggest problem with this film, like I was to probably have stated earlier. But when also looking at it, if there's a free way to say you can see this film, or a cheap way, which is like $2.99 in a number of different apps, then dare in fact go ahead and watch this movie. So with that said, goodbye everybody. Bye everybody.